Okay, Econ 421, Chapter 10, video number 2. So we're talking about what we observe about the people who migrate. Okay, so we're going to deal with a number of categories here. First, let's deal with age. Young people are more likely to move. Why? It should be kind of obvious. The terminal date t that we looked at in our equation in video 1 is going to be more years in the future. So you've got more time to reap the benefits associated with the move. Secondly, the psychic costs tend to be a lot lower. It was not so hard for me to move from New York back to California when I was single. If I was married at the time, I may not have made the move at all, right? Because the psychic costs would have been a lot greater. So young people have not invested as much in their communities, and they're more likely to go ahead and move. Hey. As we indicated in video number 1, with respect to education, higher levels of education, you have more national and geographic opportunities. Think of somebody who's a computer programmer. You can move anywhere. You don't even have to move anywhere. You could probably work out of your house, as a lot of people are doing these days. An Uber driver is not going to say, "Oh, I'm going to go drive an Uber in another state." It could certainly happen, but it's going to be less of a relevant factor. And for a lot of people, of course, that is a way station to something better, or it's something that an immigrant can easily segue to, given that some of the skill set that they have in their home countries may not be so transferable to the United States. Okay, distance is a big thing, all right? You're much more likely to move closer. So if we're looking at students who, in this class, who are planning on moving after they graduate, it's much more likely that they're going to move within the state of California, maybe to San Diego, maybe up to the Bay Area, whatever, maybe Inland Empire, Sacramento, than to move to another state. Why? Well, simple. Number one, you're going to be less likely to know the new area the further and further away you get. You're going to have less familiarity with it, less of a chance of knowing what it is you're getting into. When I moved from Montana to upstate New York, I had very little conception, except in a general sense. I'm moving to a relatively small town. It appealed to me at the time, but did I realize the town I was living in had really seen better days, and although there was some charm to it, there was also some parts of it that were pretty depressing. I didn't really know the town, and we didn't have Wikipedia back in those days, so there wasn't much you could look up online, as in nothing that you could look up online about the town. And clearly the psychic costs are going to be lower. If you're living in the valley and you move to Long Beach or something, yeah, you've moved away 30, 40, 50 miles, whatever, but the psychic costs are lower. It's easy for you to come and visit family members and friends and things like that than if you moved hours away or moved hours by plane away. Okay. With regards to immigrants, what do we observe? We're more likely to see skilled workers coming from countries, with the exception of crossing the border, okay, from Mexico. That is the one exception. But we are more likely to see skilled workers coming from countries which have a tight earnings distribution, and we're more likely to see less skilled workers coming from countries with a very wide distribution, which is what the less developed countries tend to be like. I'm going to go over this point. This point is extremely important, word to the wise. And that is that you get a lot of well-educated people moving from the UK and Europe to the United States. Why? Because taxes are so high in those countries, the really well-educated have an upper bound on what they earn that's going to be lower than the upper bound on what they can earn here in the United States. And I know personally people from the UK who are very, very highly skilled and educated who moved here clearly for the economic opportunity, trumping everything else. Now, how about less skilled individuals? People with less education, less likely to be knowledge workers, more likely to be blue-collar workers. We would tend to see them moving from countries with very wide distributions because they're going to be at the very bottom of that distribution. And coming to the U.S. is a country where there may be more government benefits, education opportunities, other things that are available to them that's going to enhance their economic situation. And someone who's a blue-collar worker, less skilled worker, semi-skilled worker in the U.S. tends to be much better off than they are in many Latin American countries, no surprise there. Also want to mention, of course, don't ignore the implicit discount rate and family considerations. The implicit discount rate really, depends on to what extent this is a generational kind of move or a single individual. We've already talked in video 1 about the impact of a change in the discount rate, and family always comes into play. Okay. Now, the move within the United States is one that's very easy to reverse, much easier to reverse than someone who migrates to the U.S. Okay. There's a lot of good stuff in the chapter. There's a lot of stuff that goes through, cuts through the sound bites and the headlines that you're going to see on the internet or you're going to see on cable news programs with regards to immigration. We just want to know the facts, okay? And the facts paint a very interesting picture as to why people come to the United States. And first and foremost, people come to the United States for economic reasons. Sure, if you're looking at certain countries with revolutions and a lot of political turmoil, Iran in the late 1970s and early 80s would be an example. Central American countries that have had a lot of political unrest, coming to the United States, people leaving the former Soviet Union to escape repression, absolutely. But the lion's share of people who come are coming because economic opportunity is better. The book talks about a study. It was done a while back in 2000, but fine, adjusted to today's dollars, and the pronunciation, the difference will be more pronounced than it was back then. Immigrants from Mexico earned $9,000 to $16,000 a year more than a comparable job in Mexico. And any proof that you want, if you look at California, when we were dealing with 10% or so unemployment in the late Bush Jr., early Obama years, so 2008, 2009, immigration from Mexico, particularly undocumented immigration from Mexico to California, reversed itself. More were leaving to go back to Mexico than were coming to the U.S. If that doesn't convince you that economic considerations really drive things, I don't know what will. Okay. What is the general experience of immigrants who come to the U.S.? It should be no surprise. I alluded to it a little bit in the video number 1 for this chapter. And we talked about the generational consideration rather than just for a single individual in moving, okay? What we find is initially the earnings are going to be below the native born, even after controlling for differences in education. So immigrants will earn less than someone who was born here in the United States for the same kind of job, even when we adjust so that we have factored in any difference in experience, any difference in education. Why? Number 1, language barriers. So if it's more difficult for someone to communicate, that's going to reduce the number of job opportunities that are available to them. Okay. Cultural differences. I know that from some of the cases that I do with my consulting firm, that you may have someone who doesn't fully understand the laws that apply to employment relationships in the United States. They do things as they would have done it back home, and they would say, well, this is the way we always do it. Not in the United States. And they end up in a lot of trouble because they've done things that are not legal in the workplace. I've seen some that would knock your socks off in terms of not understanding the rules in the U.S. I'll give you one. I'm gonna fuzz out some of the details, but someone who was an immigrant, they were employed by immigrants, they were working as a cook, they got injured on the job, and the employer made the worker hire their replacement. And that was the only condition under which they would be able to keep their job. Patently illegal under U.S. laws. Okay, so cultural barriers obviously affect the ability to succeed as well in the U.S. And then also work history, because work history is harder to evaluate and gauge for someone who was working in another country. You don't know in what capacity, how the jobs they were doing there translate here into the United States. Okay, the gap between new immigrants and the native born here has been increasing over time. Why? Well, more of the new immigrants have less human capital as we've opened up the borders, not only southern border, but also from Southeast Asia. So it's simply an observation. But where's the good news? The good news is the rate of growth in earnings is very, very high, and a human capital investment in the United States tends to pay off very, very well. So even though the earnings start off low, they tend to ramp up. And by the next generation after that, they've probably pretty much caught up at that point. Be careful about the data, okay? Just like going to college gives you this great rate of return, but wait a second. The smartest and most driven kids are the ones who go to college, so they would be successful anyway. Same thing here. Who stays? The immigrants who succeed. Who goes back? The immigrants who don't succeed. And there are many who come and then leave, go back to their home country because things did not work out for them. Okay, Volume 3, we'll talk a little bit about the U.S. immigration policy.